Hi folks, this is Don Meissner with the North Country Fishing Report. I want to tell you a little bit more about what I've been discovering in trout fishing, because you can take the same things I'm discovering and use it for bass or other fish. You know, over the past few years, since smallmouth bass have become sort of the champion of the fishing world, they're very different than largemouth. Smallmouth tend to prefer and to feed on much smaller things than largemouth do. They actually prefer that, and that's why people in the St. Lawrence River do so well using drop shot baits. Drop shot baits aren't very big; they're short, and they don't require big heavy rods or anything else to cast them. It's the same thing I'm finding in fishing the streams. I'm using baits right now that are they're no bigger than the woolly buggers or streamers that you would use fly fishing. And using a light limber rod, light line, all the rest of it can be just as much fun, honestly, as fishing and catching them on flies. I do believe. Now, fly fishermen will scoff at this because it goes against everything that makes fly fishing sort of the poetic top of the field of fishing. At least fly fishermen think that. And I've always fly fished. I'm not all that great. I'm not a good caster, but I've always caught a lot of fish fly fishing. So let's get back to what I want to tell you. There are lures now made, little tiny marabou or bucktail jigs in the 1/32 ounce range that you can cast with an ultralight rod, 4-pound test, and you can make them go through the water and look just about the same as a streamer or a woolly bugger will look as it's drifted down by a fly fisherman. And that's the secret, because fish in these streams are feeding on things that are naturally coming down the river. They know where they're going to be washed into, the fish do, that is, and they know how they should look as they're coming down. Well, you can do the same thing using a spinning rod, light line, and the type of line you choose is really critical. If you want that bait if you want it to drift naturally and not go down to the bottom as much, then you want to use lines that are floating. A fly line floats, but braided line floats. Monofilament line floats. Fluorocarbon line sinks. So if you want your fly to sink down, if you want your little jig or little bait to sink down, then fluorocarbon is much better, at least as a leader. You can tie it on to whatever line you like, whether you use a monofilament or braid, and they each have their benefits and their distractions, and I've told you about that several times. But this is what I do. I cast across stream with these tiny little jigs, and I call them jigs, but there's also soft plastic baits that I talked about also. Little tiny tube jigs. I mean tiny. 1/32 of an ounce makes a huge difference than one that doesn't look that much bigger, but that weighs 1/16 of an ounce. That's heavier. It doesn't drift the same. It'll sink down and snag more, and it really does make a difference. But you'd think some of these baits are so small, the fish wouldn't hit them. Another bait that I've used for the first time in my life, it's called a trout magnet. And it's a little they say it is 1/64 of an ounce jig head, and a tiny little worm, it's soft plastic, that's no more than an inch long. And that goes on that jig head, and you cast it out and you'd fish it almost like you could use a fly rod to do this, but I'm using a little spinning rod. And I thought, are the fish really going to hit this? You know, fish can be so selective, especially once they start feeding on underwater flies and floating, things that are coming up to the surface. They're very selective. And yet I started using these worms. And the worm I call it a worm, it's a trout magnet. And what I was using was green and black. Part of it was green and part of it was black. And I thought, maybe that'll look natural, like a grasshopper or something. A lot of things are greenish. Man, do those fish hit it. And the difference between using a nymph with a fly rod, because when you're using a nymph, you can barely detect the strike. That's what makes it so hard for people to nymph fish successfully. Actually, most of the flies that fish hit are underwater, and they're emerging upwards, and that's what these nymphs are. but they'll suck them in and spit them out so fast that you can hardly feel it. That's why people use a strike indicator. A strike indicator is a little float that goes above the nymph that will float on the surface, and when a trout hits it, you'll see it just twitch a bit, and you know, a fish is hitting, and you set the hook. Well, with these lures I'm using, these little trout magnets and these little woolly bugger-looking tiny jigs, marabou jigs, I don't have any trouble feeling the strike. I mean, they hit it. They knock it, and you can feel that violent jolt. So most of you probably won't do this, but I promise you, if you do, you don't want to use live bait. You know, most people today, that's a no-no, using live bait. It's not the right way to fish or whatever you want to say. But when you use these artificials, it's just as good as live bait, maybe better. I had to be convinced by doing it myself and seeing that this was every bit as effective as using live bait. The fish love these tiny little things, and they will hit them. And the one disadvantage is they're so little, and the hook is little, that for every 10 strikes that I get, and they're violent strikes, I may only hook 4 or 5 fish, and then a lot of those, they'll come off. So it's more the fun of the strike, the take, the seeing the fish, and now and then you're going to catch them. And I've caught a lot of them in spite of all my errors. Until next time, folks, this is Don Meissner with the North Country Fishing Report.